Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about the Good Food Institute, a charity that helps get together people who are interested in creating alternatives to factory farmed meat, um, get their startups and projects off and running, figure out legal and scientific engineering organizational questions for them, and basically does all sorts of awesome facilitating things to try and get these projects up and going. Now, why is this so important? Well, although research into clean meat, which is basically what the Good Food Institute is supporting, which is meat that's grown in labs or in these big reactors rather than by raising and slaughtering animals, is a pretty medium term, long term speculative idea. Um, it is something that the basic science works out for, and it's basically a question of getting the practicality sorted out, which is a big problem. But it's also something that has a huge payoff in that there's just tons of animals that are raised in awful conditions and slaughtered horribly every year. Um, and as a sort of uh, far-sighted solution to a large-scale problem, I think GFI is really emblematic of a sort of new perspective on charity that I think is really cool and really important, called effective altruism. So let me introduce some effective altruicities, then I'll go back to talking about GFI and how it ties into these. So what is effective altruism? Effective altruism is basically the idea that we should think about charitable donations the same way we think about all sorts of other uh, meaningful strategic questions. Uh, so rather than just think about sort of the baseline of what makes us feel good or what do I know about, we should really think about, you know, what are the best things I can do for whatever definition of best I might have. And part of what this means is that in terms of effectiveness, we shouldn't just look at, what's a sure thing that I know will help someone at least a little bit. But we should be okay with saying that, like, yeah, I think, like, I'll support this research that could really help a bunch of people or a bunch of beings down the line. Um, but it's not 100% certain. If there's only a 50% chance of creating this really, really amazing thing, maybe decades before it would have been created otherwise, then that's potentially huge amounts of good done. Even though there's some chance that it doesn't work out, that's okay. In the same way that you know it's okay if you make some life plans to do research on stuff that doesn't work out. I think if you're okay with the sort of sad feelings that come along with saying like, well, okay, this thing failed, but I still have some great research skills I can apply to some other problem or whatever. You should feel super willing to do that. Um, and the other part, besides the willingness to accept risks for the greatest expected value, or roughly magnitude of good times probability of good, is this idea of expanding our notions of altruism. So being pretty open-minded about not just helping the people who are directly around us or who we most know and think about, but helping the people who really need it and where our help can go the furthest. And not even necessarily stopping at people, of course, but helping whatever beings we think have some moral worth. It's whatever beings whose suffering matters or whose uh, pleasure matters. Um, and some ways that these principles are factored out into practically examining different questions is in the importance, neglectedness, tractability three-factor framework. So importance is basically the question of what are the biggest problems, what are the things that if we could somehow solve them, that would be a huge deal. So factory farming is obviously one of the things that's on the table there. Sorry, no pun intended. Um, and neglectedness is the question of what are problems that other people aren't already putting a lot of resources into. Basically, the intuition being that generally this means that there's all those sort of like easy doable things have been tried, and what remains is stuff that maybe is a lot less likely to work. Plus, maybe like things have gotten really bogged down in like factional disputes and stuff like that, and it becomes a little more challenging to really get things done. Although in principle, there's also a ton of people there who you could, if you could direct them towards maybe the more effective ways of doing stuff, that's still a big deal, but it's difficult. Um, and finally, tractability, which is the question of okay, so what can we actually help with? Where's the place where if we put our shoulder to the boulder, we can actually make things better? Um, and one way of thinking about this is diminishing marginal utility. So this is the idea from economics and also just from common sense that people who are worse off. If you have like if you're a millionaire, you're not gonna care too much about winning or losing $100, but for someone who's living paycheck to paycheck or just dollar to dollar, it matters a whole bunch. And while we might not all feel like we're in a position to make it rain, we're at least generally not in a position where we need to pray for rain either. Most of us are not living paycheck to paycheck in this way. On the other hand, the people who are the people who maybe most need our help out of human beings at least. Um, and you can see here that if the millionaire loses some like $100 or whatever, their happiness basically doesn't change. Happiness is the y-axis here. Money is the x-axis, and confusingly, further to the left is more money. Um, and on the contrary, if you don't have that much money to begin with, then getting that same small amount to a millionaire could be a huge deal for you. So this is another way of thinking about this idea of neglectedness. Who are the people, or where is the place where there's the least resources being put towards helping people or helping beings and reducing suffering? And one obvious answer there is, factory farming. There are just billions of animals, literally, every year who were raised in awful, unsanitary conditions where they can't go through basically any of the behaviors that they, find pleasurable or sort of naturally suited to. So for chickens, they're not able to dust bathe generally. Often they're not even really able to turn around. Their bodies are mutilated. For pigs, for example, which I picked just because I personally find them really cute, and so I thought this would be, I don't know, bring some people sympathy in a way that chickens might not do as much of. They're often not able to turn around. They live in their own filth, which, despite slanders you might have heard, pigs generally don't actually enjoy doing. And they generally have an awful time until they're brutally slaughtered. And while there is an animal movement that's trying to help them, the level of the entrenched interest against them is just huge. And in the meantime, there's tons and tons of people who eat meat because it's how they grew up. They don't really think about it, or they sort of convince themselves that animals don't matter, or at least animals that aren't dogs and cats and maybe whatever birds they like or pet fish they have or whatever. Somehow those animals are okay, but other animals just don't matter. And I think they convince themselves of this in part because it is a difficult and dramatic lifestyle change for some people to stop eating meat or to reduce their meat intake or stop eating eggs and things like that. It is a difficult cultural thing, but at the same time, these animals are suffering awfully, and it wouldn't take that much of a change in terms of people's diet shifts to really make a difference. So how can we make that happen? Well, so there's the social angle that a lot of people in the animal movement are covering of trying to convince people to change their diets, or trying to convince corporations to be more humane. But another angle, which maybe can better help reach the 95+% of Americans who are not vegetarians or vegans, is the Good Food Institute's approach of instead trying to come up with clean meat. So meat that's created, again, not by raising animals in these awful conditions and slaughtering them, but simply in a lab, in the same way that we create lots of our medicines today. And basically this is, of course, a pretty speculative thing. There are timelines that people have tried to come up with which suggest that it could be possible relatively soon, within a decade or two, or it might take a bunch of scientific and engineering revolutions to figure out. And those two things are not obviously totally contradictory. It might be the case that if we had the right people working on this problem and thinking about it and doing lots of work on it that otherwise might not happen until much later, then maybe we could really make a big difference here. And even if we push up that timeline by 5 or 10 years, that's a huge number of animals who are potentially not getting, raised in these awful conditions and slaughtered anymore. Because a big barrier for people is just the practical thing of, well, I like to eat meat and I like to have meat that, or meat, meat type things that have the same like taste and texture, and that generally is not really where we're at with most meat substitutes today, although stuff like the Impossible Burger has already had a fair amount of success just by duplicating, I think, some of the proteins in meat, just the heme, rather than the full protein structure and, I guess, macro structure too, which is what GFI is kind of ultimately trying to facilitate. So basically, GFI gets together scientists and entrepreneurs who are interested in working on these culture meat products, and tries to figure out these legal questions, tries to figure out what the key scientific questions are to answer that haven't been figured out already, helps to incubate startups and stuff like that. Um, and to be clear, I think there's variants of clean meat like the Impossible Burger that's already ironically possible. It's just the question of sort of getting the very full, uh, complete level of like being able to make a steak in the lab at cost effective levels might be really tough. But obviously, there's lots of intermediate problems that these people can work on that could really help solve the bigger problems, like just getting the mix of proteins and fats and stuff right before you try and really worry about the structure. And I think it's a really promising, again, not 100% to have an effect within the next decade or even within our lifetimes, but I think high enough chances that this kind of approach could really ultimately lead to a revolution in agriculture and the end of animal agriculture, ideally, or essentially the end, at least of the vast majority of animal agriculture that involves animals suffering horribly, because most of them do live and die on these awful factory farms. Um, so yeah, I think GFI's approach is a really promising way to do that. It's not a 100% thing, but it's a big enough chance and a big enough effect if it wins that I think it's really worthwhile. So I think GFI is doing some really cool work, supporting some really cool work, and I think it could use some support from some other awesome people like yourselves. So thank you, and let's all figure out how to make a better world for the people who need it most.